That more than fine. Thank you very much, Betty. And holy smokes, thank you all for coming out. Miserable night, and here you I was expecting maybe 3 or 4 diehards here. I got about 40 or 50 diehards instead. Wow.
And
also, I'd like
if you
to
change this
definitely
picture of the
tip the
slide, I
hat
just
up
move it
there
over and take a
to,
picture of the slide there
Roger
and
for
reason
making
around
that
for
free
a
or
couple of
whatever it is
seconds,
hour
5-10
drive up
seconds, and then
from
come back to the
Osceola,
present.
to make
Just
this
pick up the
possible.
zone.
Thank you. Where in the hell did you go, Roger? Thank you very much. You guys all hear me okay?
Yep. Yes.
All right.
Use the mic. Yeah, use the mic. It's just going to be better.
You want me to use the mic?
Absolutely.
Yep. How's that? Any better? All right. You guys have to know, though, my favorite rock band is The Who, so I may just start twirling it around a little, throwing it at people. But, okay, the program tonight, as you well know, is called The Lake is the Boss. And that comes, that's a phrase that, you know, has become fairly ubiquitous in this area in the last decade or two. You'll see people up there walking around in Bayfield with T-shirts that say this. You folks hear me now okay, by the way? Yeah, right, great. Okay, T-shirts that say, Lake is the boss. Now, among other things, right off the bat, that says, I am a tourist. One of the ways you can tell somebody who's not a local, of course, is that they're wearing a souvenir T-shirt. Anybody ever been to Ireland? Here, in here? Okay. Did you buy yourself an Aaron sweater while you were over there? Okay. I mean, you know, 30 years ago, Susan and I went to Ireland, and that was one of the first things I did to express my Celtic heritage was buy one of these Aaron sweaters, the white sweaters of the Clancy brothers. And I put it on proudly and wore it all around Ireland for the first couple days, and I realized only Americans wear these things now. So it's the best way to tell that, you know, someone is up here enjoying the place, and be nice to them because they're spending money, okay? But the lake is the boss. There's an interesting history behind that phrase. The National Lake Shore has kind of taken it on as a motto, but it really comes from the lips of an old-time Bayfield fisherman named Julian Nelson. Julian, this gentleman here, if you go down to the Great Lakes Visitor Center on Highway 2 there, one of the attractions that they have is you can stick your eyes up against a little screen there, or a peephole, and watch films of old-timers speaking. And one of the ones who they have is this old Norwegian fisherman, Julian Nelson, who's talking a little bit about how going out on the lake and the challenges of doing so. And he says, but always remember, in the end, the lake is the boss. Well, somebody heard that and said that this is a great phrase. We can market that. Some people put it as the title of a blog even. Anybody in the room do that? Yeah. But really, it doesn't belong to the park, and it doesn't belong to me, and it doesn't belong to anybody else. It's from this very wonderful man, Julian Nelson, and as far as I know, he's never got a cent of royalties from it, and I don't think he's the sort who would ever even dream of asking. But Julian, I want to talk a little about Julian and the experiences that brought him to the point where he could sagely make that pronouncement on the basis of long experience. Julian, born in the U.S., he's a second-generation Norwegian American. His father came over from Norway. Julian grew up fishing with his father. Little cocky young blonde kid there out at Presque Isle at his father's fishing camp with the 2 older sisters. And he was born in 1916. Started fishing with his father basically as soon as he could walk. And his father, interesting guy, right here again, you can see him in the background here. This is one of the photographs that we unearthed a couple of years ago taken by the Sand Island lighthouse keeper, Emmanuel Lewick. And Bobby Nelson, Julian's son, is one of my best friends. He's looking at it and says, that's my grandfather back there. John Nelson came over to the U.S. in 1890. 97, brought his fiancée over 2 years later. Julian was John Nelson was from a fishing village. His wife to-be was a city girl, and he took her out to their new home, their cabin out on Stockton Island, and she burst into tears. This is what I came to America for. But eventually, she adapted and had several children, Julian being one of them. John Nelson, don't want to indulge in stereotypes, but talk about hard-headed Norwegians. He was partners for a while with another fisherman named Carl Ludvigsen. And John and Carl quarreled at one point. I mean, seriously quarreled enough to dissolve the partnership. And things went fine. You know, you take these nets, I'll take those nets. You take this boat, I'll take that boat. Until they got to the twine shed, the great big building that they used to mend the nets and store their gear. Well, there's only one thing to do, and these two Norwegian-American silent strong types got up on the roof of the building with saws and without a word exchanged to each other, cut the building in half, and each walked away with their half of the building. So Julian learned to fish from his father, and war comes along, he joins the Marines, goes off to fight in the Pacific, and when the war is over, he's pushing 30 years old, and he's ready to go out on his own. His father's ready to retire, so he buys his father's fishing outfit, and he wants to leave Stockton Island. He wants a place of his own. And up here on Rocky Island, one of the first generation of Norwegian immigrants who were fishing off of Rocky Island, a gentleman named Olaf Edvards, is ready to retire. He wants to sell his land, his little property out there on the island. And Julian says, that's the perfect place for me to set up my fish camp. So he buys the land from Olaf Edwards, and everything's working fine, but he's got a really nice cabin there at Presque Isle, Stockton Island. They had gone to some effort to really fix it up nicely before the war interrupted things. Now it's 1947. He doesn't want to leave it behind. So, what do? He goes to Halvor Reiten, and people are probably aware of Halvor Reiten's boatyard in Bayfield. Halvor Reiten was behind so much of the maritime industry in the area at the time. And he asked, let me let Julian tell it himself from this point. Because I was lucky enough to interview him about 10 years ago, and I've got it here. Julian says, so I approached Halvor Reiten, and I asked if he'd take on the job of moving it. And he said, well, let's go take a look at it. So Halvor and I went out and took a look at it. He says, sure, I think we can move it. He had a pond boat, and it was probably 30 or 32 feet long, and it was 16 or 18 feet wide, pretty beamy, and it must have had about 3-foot sides on it. Now, this is a pond boat. Spelled pound. We know the pond nets that they use. This is the small boat that they would use to move in and out among the nets that would be towed behind the big boat. He says, let's put it on my pond boat. He had a pond boat that was probably 30 feet long, and he says, we'll use it. We'll float it on that. And there were 5 of us all together. And we had some good manpower, me and Halvor Reiten, and my hired man, June Thompson, and 2 other guys. Bill Noring and Van Ashman. He was a retired teacher from Ashland. He thought we were nuts, and he said so several times. And all the work had to be done by hand. The only mechanical device we had was a chain fall. This is a modern version. It's a hand-powered winch, basically using chains. We had a heavy chain, and we had the winch anchored to a tree, and we had 12 by 12 timbers for the cabin to slide on, and we kept them greased, and we moved it notch by notch. And at the end of the day, we had moved it quite a bit. And we had to turn it around and take it endwise down the bank to where we were going to load it. And we got it down, and it was a real windy day. And the wind was out of the west, and I always had the feeling that, darn it, we'll move it at night, and then the wind will go down. Then we got it loaded on the boat, and the wind went down, and then we started out. And then all of a sudden, we got a northeaster coming, and it must have been blowing down the lake because we got these big swells right away. No, you don't get the big swells right away with a northeaster. Not right away. It takes a while. It must have been blowing down the lake. But so we had those big swells, and then when we got around the point, we could see that we're not going to make it. It was kind of harrowing from that point for a while, because that cabin was catching a lot of wind, and we had difficulty to get it turned around so we could get back. But we got it back to the bay, and then we put it on the anchor where I kept my fish boat. But we'd taken an awful lot of water in the pond boat where we left the island with it to go to Rocky. We probably only had about 6 inches of freeboard when we started out. And then when we got in those swells, she would dip down to take a big scoop of water. And we really had no pump, so we got underneath there, my hired man and I, and we bailed the boat out with a water pail, and then we decided, oh, no, that's not going to work. So we better get back to shore with it where we can save it. So we brought her back to shore and figured we'd leave her on the beach there until it went down, but there was so much sea on the beach that the pond boat took more of a racking, and then we decided, no, this isn't going to work either. So we decided we better unload it, and we unloaded the house again, put it back in the beach in the same place that we had loaded it. Anyway, then when we looked at the pond boat, we could see it taking quite a wreck. It was a wooden pond boat, and it wasn't exactly a young pond boat. And it was wrecked pretty bad, and Howard decided we better bring a pond boat to town and repair it. So he did that. He went to town with the pond boat. All that work. To take the cabin out for an excursion on the lake, a sightseeing trip with the house. And basically, that's where the cabin's sitting, at least for the moment. Because we're going to talk about some other things. We're going to talk about a few other things now, and we'll come back and check and see how the cabin's doing a little later on. But Betty was so nice to say talk about my interest in history, and I really appreciate that. I have to say, one of the neat things about studying history is that you never run out of topics because they're always making more. I committed to do this program months ago, and I had a rough idea. I always have a rough idea what I want to talk about, and then I go on and I think of other things. But 2 weeks ago, we had an incident right here in right outside of Washburn that rivals just about anything that I would have found in the history books or the old records. Maybe some of you saw it in the paper. A couple of years ago, I did a program called Out on the Ice. If any of you came to see that, you may recall how I talked about an incident that happened off of Odena in 1933, in March of 1933, when there were some 20 men stuck out on the ice off of Long Island. The ice had broken up and they're all floating free, and it was quite the major incident at the time, particularly given the primitive state of communication. There was very difficult to tell how many people were really out there, who managed to get off, who were saved. Some men were brought into Odena by daring rescues. I mean, guys went out in rowboats in horrendous seas to bring back these fishermen who were out on the lake. Others managed to hop from floe to floe and finally made it ashore all the way off in Saxon, for heaven's sakes. And in the end, it appears that all the men out on the lake, there's probably about 20, it looks like everyone was saved. But it's never quite sure because, again, communications in 1933 are nothing like they are today. And there was rumors that, yeah, well, when the last boatload of fishermen came back safely, they said, there's still one guy out there. I can see his silhouette. He's down on his knees praying. Well, that praying man may or may not have existed. The one thing we can say for sure, fortunately, there were no local families who reported any losses. So if there was one single man lost out on there, he was from out of the area and no one ever came looking for him. So I like to think that basically that praying man was simply a trick of someone's imagination. But I'll tell you what, 2 weeks ago down off of Bono Creek, we had an incident which every bit comparable and had the potential for being every bit as disastrous. And even with the modern technology we have today, it just goes to show when you read about the details of what happened, number one, how even with the best of equipment and the best of communications, there's still no certainty that you're going to get back alive. And the absolute courage of the people who go out to put their own lives at risk for the sake of others. I don't know a whole lot about this incident more than what I read in the papers. And you know, Pete, if there's something I missed, fill me in. But you know, when you read the account in the papers, it was two groups of ice fishermen, 5 of each, out there the morning after Christmas. When all of a sudden the wind comes up, that was recorded at 46 miles an hour in some places, and the ice breaks up, and suddenly you've got these groups of men out there on the lake, stranded and in imminent danger of death. And the folks from the Ashland Fire Department responded with their Ice Angel, the wind sled here. There were 2 departments here that have these wind sleds, Ashland and Point, and they have clearly shown what a godsend they can be at times like this. But they also show, that even with modern equipment, it takes a hell of a lot of courage to go out there. What happened, and again, going very quickly through the newspaper account, the initial word came in, the fire department was actually out there at a hot pond by the power plant practicing, so they were ready to go immediately. It was one stroke of good luck, and it was, as far as I can tell, the last stroke of good luck that anybody had during that particular incident. Because when they got out past the breakwater, they were faced with 5 to 6 foot seas and ice chunks floating everywhere. Well, here's how the Daily Press reported what the firefighters from Ashland encountered. Before the craft was able to reach the Bono Creek area, the 502 horsepower Chevrolet racing engine was cranked up to the red line to make any progress against the stormy seas. Despite the conditions, the crew was able to make contact with 5 ice fishermen at the Bono Creek area. They had to leave their 2 rescue swimmers in their survival suits standing on the ice as the overloaded boat made its way to shore with the uninjured fishermen. Yeah, think about that for a minute. These guys are volunteers, and they get off their boat to stand on the ice floe in place of the fishermen so they can get back. After picking up the 2 rescue swimmers, the Ice Angel headed about a mile north to the group off of Thompson's West End Park. We found out that there were 5 people there, not 4, and we picked those people up, Captain Tim said. At that time, we were quite overloaded, and I made the decision to cruise in at Thompson's West End Beach. I didn't want to go back to Bono Creek. The waves were too large and could sink the craft. The craft managed to make the trip to Thompson's, breaking ice all the way back, and that's when the rescue encountered its final difficulty. Yeah, like they needed another. Once they were having problems steering. And once they got back to shore, they found out that the boat had taken such a pounding that the muffler was coming apart, and the muffler was melting the steering cables. That part of the muffler failed, which in turn melted part of the steering cable. Had it broken in open water, said the captain, I honestly don't know what would have happened. If we had caught that vessel in between waves without power, it might have flipped us. But they went out anyway, and they saved 10 lives. And that's not the first time the Ashland Fire Department has I totally. 6 years before that, they went out to help men off of Saxon, all the way east to Saxon, when a group of something like 50 ice fishermen were out on the lake when it suddenly broke up. And just about everybody got back to shore. Meanwhile, the Ashland crew is hauling pedal to the metal to get there. There's still 2 men unaccounted for out on the lake. Well, again, going out in very, very challenging conditions, they managed to bring these men back. And a couple days later, the outdoor writer for the Duluth News-Tribune managed to track these guys down and interview them and ask, what was it like being out there on the ice floe, bobbing around out there by yourself? It was 2 old geezers, you know. One of them, the young guy in his 60s, you know, probably like me, and then an 80-year-old guy. They've been fishing forever together, and they were out there actually with the one guy's grandson and 8-year-old grandson. So fortunately, they were able to get the little kid back to the lake, and the fathers take the little kid, and the old guys hoofing it along as best they can, but it breaks up underneath them. And for the next 2 hours, they're bobbing around on cakes of ice. What was it like? Well, yes, Mike Popko, one of the guys, spoke very eloquently. He said, it was awful. It was like a bowl of Jello with all this busted ice. Skip and I would be in the troughs beneath the waves, and we couldn't see each other. I really didn't think I was going to make it. From that point on, and for almost 2 more hours, Wick and Popko were alone on their respective floes. They couldn't communicate over the gnashing and grinding of the ice. Popko said when a wave would crest, the chunks would separate. Then to the troughs, one big chunk would crash into another one, and it would about knock you on your rear end. I looked at the situation and I said, am I going to drown or am I going to get crushed to death? Yeah, well, they did. And again, thanks to the men and women of the Ashland Fire Department and all the people who support their efforts, from Congressman Obey, who brought that Ice Angel down to us all the way down. It's a lot of lives been saved. And Pete, I see there, our man from Ashland right there. Thanks on behalf of all of us. Yeah. But, it's interesting, so many of these episodes where people are lost on the lake and you wonder what went through their minds in the last moment. Now and then you get the opportunity to know what they're thinking, like this gentleman here was trying to figure out, well, I wonder exactly how it's going to work out. My mind immediately goes back to the Raspberry Island lighthouse keeper, a gentleman named Francis Yocker in 1887, who is marooned on Oak Island when his boat was blown by a storm, and he ended up fetched up on the beach at Oak Island, totally frozen, without food, basically wearing only his jammies. And he sat there for 3 days, getting colder and colder and hungrier, and finally he survived because he was eventually rescued, and years later he wrote down in great detail about what he went through in those 3 days out on Oak Island. And he said, eventually I got to thinking, what's going to happen to my body? Will I ever get a decent Christian burial, or will it just be eaten by bears or wolves or something? And I thought for a while, and I realized, no, someone will notice that the lighthouse beacon is out, and they'll figure out that something happened to me, and they'll start looking, and they'll see the wreckage of my boat on the beach, and that'll give them enough of a lead to figure out where they can find my bones. when the only comfort you have left is that, well, I'll probably get a halfway decent burial. That means you're definitely at the end of your rope. And when I was doing some research last year on another topic, I came across a story of a young man who was kind of in a similar pickle and contemplating his mortality. We're all familiar with the sea caves now along the mainland shore. We get there in the summer, got there in the winter. We were lucky enough we got there before the word went out and everybody else in the universe came. And you had to walk 3 miles just to park your car. I think a fellow back in 1921 would have been very happy to see a crowd out there. You go out there and it's a neat little place. Imagine being stuck in a cave overnight, basically marooned and again half naked, wearing nothing but a bathing suit. And that's exactly what happened to a young man from Canada in 1921. Washburn Times tells all about it on August 18th, 1921. Marooned in a tiny wave-cut cave at Squaw Bay Point, with full desolate cliffs on either side, cutting him off for nearly a mile, K.L. Shiras, a Canadian spending the summer at Bayfield, spent an entire night and part of the next day when his canoe capsized during a heavy storm. On the wall of the little cliff where the wind howled and the waves beat menacingly at his feet, Shiras gave himself up and prepared to meet his death. Using a sharp piece of sandstone, he scratched his own obituary into the rock as he grew weaker. Water cold. Lost canoe, August 9th. K.L. Shiras, Fini. Love to all at home. The accident which so nearly caused Shiras' death happened on Tuesday in the evening. During a heavy storm which struck this section, Shiras was on a canoe trip. The water has whipped into foam, and he tried to make land, but failed in the seething white caps of Squaw Point, which is about 5 miles east of Cornucopia. Shiras' canoe capsized. All his clothing was lost. Shiras clung to the canoe desperately, but it was driven farther from shore. Finally, he abandoned it and struck out in the foaming water for shore. How long he swam, he does not know. Darkness came on before he reached the forbidding cliffs of Squaw Bay, but there was no possible place to land. Groping with his hands for a place to hold, he was driven by the waves against the rock. Wounded, he swam further and tried, but again he was rebuffed. It was pitch dark, and as he swam vainly, seeking safety, then suddenly the waves would rise and hurl him at the cliff. His bathing suit was torn nearly off. His knees, arms, hands, and head were bruised and bleeding. Growing weaker and weaker, Shiras continued to grope about for a landing place. When he was almost worn out beyond endurance, his hand found a ledge about 2 feet from the water. Waiting for an especially big wave, he dragged himself onto the cliff. It was a tiny haven he had found, but he found it just in time. A wind-worn cave too small to stand erect in and right next to the open sea. But it was a welcome retreat. All through the night, Shiras maintained a lonely vigil in a cave, and through the morning hours, he looked out upon the dreary miles of waters where boats seldom came. As the hours passed and hope grew fainter, he penned what he believed, they say penned, actually rocked, what he believed was his own obituary, for death seemed certain. There was no possible place to gain land within 3/4 of a mile, only the steep forbidding cliffs. He was too weak to attempt the long swim. Dressed in the battered bathing suit, he grew colder and colder, weaker and weaker. And after what seemed hours, he spied a fishing boat. He called out to it as it came by, but the noise of the engine drowned his voice, so it seemed that no one would hear. He called time after time. But the fishing boat was towing a smaller boat carrying nets. In this, one of the fishermen was resting, and from here, sufficiently far from the boat's engine, he heard Shiras' faint cry. Scarcely believing that a human being was anywhere along the deserted wall of stone, he called to the others. They came closer and spied Shiras, naked, bleeding, and almost overcome in the miniature cave. He was taken to cornucopia and revived with warm food and then brought to Bayfield. You talk about a 1 in a million chance that there happened to be a guy in a little pond net boat behind the big fish tug. Talk about this guy's used up all of his 9 lives. Now, Mr. Shiras, we know nothing else. I've never been able to find anything else about this gentleman, Mr. Shiras. He was basically a stranger from out of the area. He came here, and ventured to tell the grandkids many years later, and left. And we know no one else with that name around the area. It doesn't turn up in our history, at least. On the other hand, there are very few names more familiar in the history of these parts than that of Bataan. The Bataan fishing family has been an important part of the Bayfield community since 1870. And 12 years after Mr. Shiras' ordeal, a couple of young men by that name faced their own. It all starts with a little entry in the Bayfield Press, January 21st, 1932. A telegram received here Monday afternoon at 3 o'clock told Ulrich Bataan, Bayfield fisherman, of the safety of his 2 sons, Allison and Wilford. The telegram came from Ontonagon, Michigan, and simply said, arrived here at 10 this morning, all okay. The brothers, 27 and 24 years old, had been adrift on Lake Superior in a 21-foot fish boat without food since Wednesday of last week. Yeah, okay? Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, drifting on the lake in a boat that probably looked very much like this one in January. Okay, well, telephone calls to Ontonagon revealed that the Bataan boys had been blown ashore in their boat on a sandy beach at Union Bay, 18 miles west of Ontonagon, and that they were safe and not seriously injured by their terrible experience. Allison and Wilford had left Michigan Island, where with their father and other fishermen from this city had camps for winter fishing operations, at 3 o'clock Wednesday afternoon of last week to go 7 miles to a point north of Presque Isle where they expected to bait their hook lines and then return to their camp. And get an idea, okay, here's Michigan Island here. They were going to head up and then head back. They had just finished baiting their hooks when a squall came up out of the southwest. They started to run for the shelter of Presque Isle, Stockton Island, but were 5 minutes from the lee of the island when the storm hit them. 3 big waves came over the stern of their boat, flooding the whole inside of the boat, wetting the magneto of the engine and killing it. They were unable to get the engine started again, all the while drifting before the gale, which blew them out into the open lake. 3 fish boxes were made into a drag anchor, but this did not seem to aid them much except to hold the helpless boat before the wind. All that night until 8 o'clock Thursday morning, the boys worked on the stalled engine before finally getting it to run again. When it did start, they found their boat had iced down until it was covered with 6 inches of ice. According to Wilford, she was rolling like a drunken sailor, and we had some time getting the ice off her with a hammer and a small piece of pipe. They were about 25 miles out in the open lake when they headed back into the teeth of the gale toward Michigan Island with the engine working once more. After a 2-hour run, and just as the island was coming into view, their gas gave out and the engine died once more. During Thursday and part of the night, the storm continued to drift the boat toward Ontonagon. Sometime during the night, the wind shifted and started them back over the track they had just made to bring them in sight of Michigan Island Friday afternoon. Once again, a change of wind took them back to Mineral Point, near Ontonagon. This game was kept up by the wind for 5 days, driving them several hundred miles back and forth between Michigan Shore and the Apostle Islands, but never close enough to be anything but a tantalizing disappointment. Meanwhile, of course, at home, the families know there's something wrong, so they, see what they, start searching. At one time, while Wilford was on watch, he saw the Coast Guard cutter Crawford coming toward them. He could see the spars high above the steam, and then knew helplessly that the Crawford's course would carry her past them. Though the boys shouted and waved, the crew apparently did not see them because of the steam and the high waves. They shouted whenever they caught sight of land. Their throats became hoarse and sore, not only from the shouting, but from the oil fumes created by the slow-burning rags. Their faces grew black almost beyond recognition from oil smoke and from fighting the fire on the first night out. Their hands were, fighting the fire on the first night, their hands were raw, and one of Wilford's was becoming infected from frostbite. Ice had formed from the sides of the boat, which steadied it some in the water, but they had to keep knocking off part of it to keep from sinking. As they knocked it off, the icy spray dashed over them, and their clothes became encrusted with ice. While a perverse and vexing fate had made every effort to save themselves futile, Monday morning brought a turn in that fate to favor them, for they were blown ashore by a north wind on the only sand beach on the south shore of Lake Superior between Ontonagon and the Black River, 50 miles west. From Union Bay, and there you can see it over there, the little yellow dot there. From Union Bay to Black River, the shoreline is rocky and it is backed by high Porcupine Mountains. And that shoreline is uninhabited and no roads lead to civilization. And then, said Allison, the wind changed to offshore not 30 seconds after we hit the beach. If we'd been a few hundred feet further from shore, we would have been driven out again, and we did not have the strength to make another attempt to get ashore through the water. Now, of course, they're not out of trouble yet, because, they're basically, they're hypothermic, starved, exhausted, and they're out on this beach, but they see a cabin in the distance. When they got out of their boat on the sandy Union Bay shore, they discovered a fisherman's shack just a half a mile to the west. That seems but a little distance off, but Wilford said it seemed like we would never make that half mile. We had not felt so bad in the boat, but when we tried to walk, our feet were just like chunks of lead. We could not lift them over even a small rock or a piece of driftwood, but just stumbled and fell time and again. They finally get to the cabin. The guy is at home, fortunately. He looks out and sees these two strange figures. I mean, looking barely human. And finally, they get it across that they're not here to rob him. That they need help badly. So he lets them in and feeds them and warms them up. And then that afternoon, he finds a friend to drive him to town, and they can send a telegram home. And then the Bataan boys rest overnight and then start to work on fixing their boat. Is they going to ever go out on the lake again? Of course they are. That's what Great Lakes fishermen do. They fix up the boat on Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, and they have it running again on Friday. They hop into the boat and head on homeward on that same lake where they just spent all that ordeal. But they've got perspective. They re-examine priorities at that point. Wilford was quoted. Our tobacco held out until Sunday noon. Up until that time, we had not noticed our hunger so much. After that, it was tough going. You can bet next time we go out, we're going to have plenty of tobacco. Priorities. So, those are two guys in a little boat. And of course, when you think of, adventures and excitement on the lake, you think of the great shipwrecks that people talk about, and everybody knows Edmund Fitzgerald, the song, and that song, of course, has particular resonance and poignancy here because a good 5 of the men on the crew come from Washburn and Ashland, and people you see in town today lost family members around here. But there were so many other ships that ran into trouble on the lake. And one of the spots that absolutely fascinates me in the Apostle Islands is Gull Island. This little tiny hunk of sand, no more than an acre in size at this point, off of Michigan Island. Among other things, it's the only one of the Apostle Islands that I had not personally set foot on. I never had a good excuse to go there. Most of the year it's closed off as a bird sanctuary, and you don't get out on Gull Island unless there's a really good reason to, even if you're working for the park like I was. The other thing is, there's a reason they call it Gull Island, and you can smell it before you get to it, and I never really had that great an urge to get out and wait around on it. But that's not what fascinates me about it. It's basically a ship-eating monster. If you look at the overhead for the aerial, this is from Google Earth, you can see, the shoals here between it and Michigan Island. There's just a lot of shallow water around Gull Island. And the lighthouse on Michigan Island, which was placed in the wrong spot to begin with, is all the way down here. It does absolutely no good to warn mariners of the hazards up here. It's completely hidden. Matter of fact, it was an adage among seafarers on the lake that in order to see the Michigan Island light, first you had to run over Gull Island. And over the years, it took a lot of ships into its trap. As early as 1865, one of the Great Lake captains, Alexander McDougall, a man almost legendary in the Great Lakes, he designed the whaleback freighters like the Meteor at Superior. In his early years, he was first mate on a boat taking the trade goods, the payment goods, to the very last Indian treaty payment at Grand Portage, and he ran aground on Gull Island on a foggy night, managed eventually to get off. Ships that went down over the years on Gull Island, 1899, the R.G. Stewart, a packet steamer, little freight boat, utility boat that just went back and forth between the ports on the Great Lakes. It wasn't one of the great big ones carrying ore to Cleveland. Rather, they were just delivering packages and passengers between Ashland and Ontonagon and Duluth and the North Shore. And on a night in 1899, they had a crew of 8, 3 passengers, and a cargo of about 20 cattle when it ran aground on Gull Island. Good news and bad news on that. They didn't seem to sustain much damage when they ran aground. They waited overnight. Then the couple men went out in a lifeboat and set an anchor. And the idea was they were going to, quote unquote, kedge off. Basically, they would take their winch and haul in the line against the anchor and then just drag themselves off the rocks that way. But in doing so, the winch was powered by a smaller auxiliary steam engine called a donkey boiler, and it took so much that the donkey boiler overheated and set the boat on fire. Then you have a real problem. The lifeboat came back, took off everybody, they pushed all the cattle overboard. Things are going basically smooth evacuation, but the flames start looking at the backside of the very last sailor to leave the boat, and he takes a flying leap, lands on the gunnels of the rowboat of the lifeboat, flips it over, and now everybody's in the drink together, men and cattle swimming around. The lifeboat is still tied to the burning Stewart, mind you, so the men are hanging on to this lifeboat, which is tied to the burning steamer, until finally the flames burn through the ropes, and then they can kind of kick and paddle their way to shore. everybody survived except for that one panicky sailor who jumped at the last moment. Mostly we're having stories with happy endings here, and this is almost a happy ending except for that one sad gentleman. Well, I know even all the cows survived. And just one of many. 6 years later, the famed quote-unquote Mataafa storm, the great storm in the end of November 1905, which sank something like 30 ships across the western Great Lakes. It sank the steamer Mataafa right off of Park Point in Duluth. Everybody could watch these poor sailors freezing to death before their eyes. It was, but today we would call it a media spectacle. But this particular boat, the William Corey, was the flagship of the Pittsburgh Steamship Line, one of the great freight lines in those days. It ran aground on Gull Island in the course of that great storm, and it sat there for about a week. It eventually took, 2 weeks, and it took the efforts of 4 large ships, 3 tugs, 158 men, and several cases of dynamite blasting the rock away to get the Corey off. But the one I want to talk about happened a year later with a ship called the R.L. Ireland. The Ireland was another steamer. This is carrying automobiles in this picture that I was able to scare up. But it was carrying coal at the time. And the local papers provide a really vivid account. And I always have fun reading through the papers because it's like you're being there watching the things unfold in real time. Because you don't know the ending, they don't know the ending yet, and you don't know it, so we're wondering what's going to happen. And on December 7th of 1906, the Bayfield County Press reported breathlessly, steel steamer Ireland, bound for Duluth, runs aground on Gull Island Reef, loses bearings in a blinding snowstorm Thursday afternoon. She is leaking badly. During the heavy northeast wind and snowstorm which raged over Lake Superior yesterday, the steel steamer Ireland, bound for Duluth with a cargo of 7,600 tons of soft coal, ran aground on the Gull Island Reef at the north end of the island. The snow and steam hanging over the lake were so dense as to make it almost impossible to keep the bearings. Full extent of the damage to the vessel is unknown, but she is leaking badly. Tugs have been telegraphed for from Duluth to assist in floating the steamer. The crew rowed to Bayfield, a rowboat, and reached there in safety at 7 o'clock this morning. The suffering of the crew during this row from Gull Island to Bayfield during the extreme cold weather of last night can very readily be imagined. Well, okay, everybody's safe. The ship is up there. Some of the men are still on the ship. Others are now in Bayfield arranging for the salvage efforts. What do you do? First of all, let's lighten the boat. Let's get some of those 7,000 tons of coal off. So the very next day, the Bayfield Press reports 30 laborers from Bayfield were taken to Gull Island yesterday on the tugs Arthur and E.G. Crosby. Remember that one, folks. They were employed in throwing the coal overboard and paid $1 an hour for the work. That, folks, was a fortune. Okay? That was Christmas coming early for these guys to get this gig shoveling coal off the Ireland. That's like, 30 or 40 bucks an hour today. They worked all night shoveling coal from the stranded steamer Ireland, but the big vessel is apparently as hard on the rocks this morning as it was yesterday. Well, they began to realize they need a bigger boat. Just like in Jaws, we need a bigger boat. Yeah, so they got one of the biggest tugs on the western Great Lakes to come and pull it off, the Manistee. And this was a well-known salvage tug. It got here, papers announced it breathlessly. The Manistee arrived today, was assisted by the 2 tugs in trying to pull the Ireland off. But the work had to be abandoned yesterday on account of the high sea that was running. And then more problems. The Manistee blows out a pipe in one of its steam lines that has to come back to Bayfield. Now it's time to bring in the expert. The gentleman named Captain James Reed, well known as like the the expert on salvage, Great Lakes salvage in those days. He's Canadian, he comes from up somewhere in Lake Huron. Captain James Reed, the veteran wrecker of Sarnia, Ontario, there we go, arrived in the city this afternoon to take over the wrecking operations on the steamer Ireland at Gull Island. Captain Reed is the best-known wrecker on the Great Lakes. He wrecked the Savona, Catawba, Crescent City. Funny use of that term. When I had to tell my parents that I wrecked my car. He wrecked the Savona and other vessels last fall, most of which he saved. At present, he has crews that work on a half a dozen wrecked vehicles on the Great Lakes. He is in personal charge of the operations at Gull Island. The Ireland is found worse than the Corrie was last fall, says Captain Reed. It is on full length. Of the 7,000 tons of soft coal, we have shoveled about 500 tons into the lake and expect to throw overboard possibly 2,000 tons or more. The Manistee has broken a steam pipe, and we have done absolutely nothing today. I expect a new pipe on this afternoon's train, and we will resume work tomorrow morning, and with good luck, hope to have the Ireland off in 3 days. But you can't tell. It may take a long time, especially if we have bad weather. Well, about that, Captain. Remember how we said the lake is the boss? Even if you're the hotshot like, salvage captain on the lakes. Bayfield Press, December 12th. Surprise to the wreckers today. Big vessel suddenly floats off rocks. Crosby, the only vessel near. Yeah, the steamer Ireland. And let's see, that's the Crosby, little boat. Yeah, keep an eye on this one. The steamer Ireland was unexpectedly released from Gull Island early this morning. It was something as a surprise to the crew of the Manistee, which was at Bayfield. Well, repairs are taking place on its steam pipe. The first intimation they had of the Ireland's release was it came into Bayfield Harbor, towed by the tug F.G. Crosby. Well, yes, indeed. Captain Reed gathers his resources. He says, well, okay, we're going to patch up the leaks temporarily, and we'll take the Ireland to Duluth for permanent repairs. All we need to do is wait for a break in the weather. But of course, time is money, and you know, you don't want to delay unnecessarily, and so they head out 2 days later, and things do not go according to plan. As a matter of fact, everything I just said about the Ireland now is prelude to the really bad stuff. The Bayfield Press again helps us out. What is undoubtedly one of the worst experiences ever had on the lakes by a ship's crew occurred last Friday night about 2 miles out from Sand Island. The steel steamer R.L. Ireland, which was driven ashore on Gull Island during a heavy storm 2 weeks ago, and which had been released and brought to this port for repairs, left here for Duluth Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock in tow of the wrecker Manistee, and with the tug Crosby acting as trailer. The Ireland had been lying in the Bayfield Harbor several days, awaiting favorable weather, and during a temporary abating of the wind, cleared for Duluth Friday. The journey to Sand Island was made without mishap, but upon venturing out onto the open lake, a fierce gale from the southwest was encountered, and when it was about 2 miles out from Sand Island, the ships were buffeted by an enormous sea. The waves were of such height and strength as to completely wash over the Ireland and its escorts, carrying away all loose machinery and other pieces, including the air compressors used to keep the water out of the Ireland. At a point when the seas were rolling monstrously high, the tow line between the Manistee and the Ireland parted. The Manistee faded from view before the anxious eyes of the watchers on the Ireland, and being unable to turn about or determine the whereabouts of the big steamer, the captain of the Manistee deemed it best to run with the wind, and Saturday morning, the Manistee put into Port Arthur, or Thunder Bay now, on the North Shore, considerably battered and covered with ice. Yeah, basically they buggered off. And you've got the Ireland now floating loose in this horrendous storm. Shortly after the disappearance of the Manistee, the tow line became tangled in the propeller of the Ireland. broken rudder rendered the big steamer helpless and at the mercy of the elements. And it seemed as though at any moment the big seas would cause her to go down. Seeing that the boat was powerless to help herself, orders were given to lower the anchor and signal whistles constantly blown for the Majestique. But no Majestique put in an appearance. But at this moment, the tug Crosby, which had been almost forgotten in the excitement, shot into view from behind the Ireland and quickly proved of invaluable service to the forlorn crew of the big boat. To the admirable bravery and unflinching nerve of Captain Cornwall and the crew of the tug Crosby are due the lives of those aboard the disabled steamer. Captain Cornwall found it necessary to make 18 trips around the Ireland before being able to get all of the crew off the big steamer, and made 3 trips around for the last man. He's credited with saying that he would get every member of the Ireland's crew on board his boat or go to a watery grave himself. In fact, he came damn close to doing it. One man was lost on the Ireland in the process of transferring people. Saved all but one of that helpless, hapless crew. But let's move away from the newspaper accounts and ask one of the sailors themselves. Fortunately, the newspaper did run into somebody over the bars in Bayfield who could give a first-hand account. One of the sailors from the Ireland drifted into port today. Sailor-like, he is stranded without a cent. He's looking for a berth on the next ship that comes along. He was one of the 5 men that volunteered to go in a small boat from Gull Island to Bayfield for relief, and he was on the Ireland last Friday night when the trouble occurred. There were 5 of us left. The Crosby saved all those forward, and left the 5 of us with a woman aft. Andy Dillon was drowned early. About the time that we were aft were trying to run forward, Andy was washed overboard, and he cried out as he disappeared, "Someone help me, they're coming!" That was his last. We thought the Crosby had gone and left us. After took off all forward, but that skipper Cornwall, oh my God, he is a man. We hung out a light, and the tug came tearing through the seas for us. Oh, that skipper, he threw us a line, and we threw him one, and that makes 2. And then we lashed the woman. She was the steward's wife. We lashed her to the lines, and we got her into the tug. And sometimes we were afraid the Crosby would come aboard of us. The waves were higher than our decks. We all got off, but me chum Deffy. Deffy had been an artilleryman during the Boer War. They couldn't hear hardly nothing now. It was the last aboard. The Crosby came along in our lee, and a big wave threw her against us, and we thought it was all off. But, oh, that skipper on the Crosby, he's a man. He jammed his wheel over, and that boat wasn't hard enough to sink the tug. He had to turn clear around the Ireland twice, taking off that one man, Deffy. Just think of the nerve of that man, with 17 of us aboard his little eggshell of a tug. And in addition to his own crew, some of the boys were praying. I don't think they did real well at it, but there was no time to post up. I mean, every time we dropped into a big sea down toward the bottom of the lake, I started a little special service of my own. Oh, but the skipper, he rounded his tub on the lee side, and Ireland, there stood Deffy, hanging with a rope in one hand and the rail in the other. "Chop off, you blame fool!" yelled the skipper Cornwall through his megaphone. But of course, Deffy didn't hear a damn thing, bless his stars. But he jumped anyway, landed on his face on a pole heap, and he said he saw more fireworks that he struck than he did at the Battle of Lookout Hill. Next day, they all go back down to see if they can round up the Ireland again. After getting everybody back into Bayfield and regrouping, they go back to try and get the boat. We went out again Sunday to the Ireland. The tugs B.B. Inman and F.G. Crosby. Now, the Inman is a bigger and stronger than a Crosby, but you know what? Do you suppose the entire crew of the Ireland did? We just naturally piled onto the Crosby.
We thought the Crosby was good enough for us. We had a kind of superstition about the boat by then. She was all right, and the same I will maintain about the skipper of that tug. Me, my name is Shorty, that's all you need. Well, what happened next? Long story, I could go on for quite a while, because they eventually did again. They couldn't manage it, so they beached it on the sand at Frog Bay. They got a hard hat diver to go down and untangle the lines around the props. They replaced the rudder right there on the beach at Frog Bay, towed it into Bayfield, waited a few more days, and then eventually got it into Duluth. But if you look ahead, I think one of the things that really interests me is what happened to the different players in the drama. And the Crosby, here's a photo, actual photo of the, not the Crosby, the Ireland at Bayfield after it had been pulled off and basic repairs done. The Captain Reed, you know, the big shot wrecker, he actually comes back to the Apostles again 3 years later for another episode when the freighter James Hoyt was grounded off at Outer Island, and he succeeded pretty handily after several days getting the Hoyt off the beach at Outer Island. He brought his biggest boat, the one even bigger than the Manistee Otto, which is the pride of his fleet. He brought that, and with a couple other boats, they managed to get the Hoyt off safely. They bring it into the shelter of Oak Island, set anchor, get settled for the evening before they're going to, go on to the next stage. The men on the Ottawa sit down to supper, and while they're eating, the Ottawa catches fire. Apparently spontaneous combustion in the coal workers. The Ottawa is a complete loss. So basically he saved the Hoyt and lost his own best boat. I don't think he ever came back to the Apostles again. After that, the Manistee becomes his main vessel. The Manistee, you follow down their career, it continued for a number of years to work in the salvage trade. It was finally scrapped in 1933. That little eggshell tub wooden boat, Crosby, it only had a few years of life left. It was already an old boat, and it was scrapped 6 years later in 1914. But the Ireland, let's see, we went a little ahead there. The Ireland, it soldiered on. It ran into some more difficulties in 1909 when it had a small collision off of Buffalo. On Lake Huron. In 1922 at Buffalo, it was blown ashore by a freak gale, but nonetheless, it soldiered on, and through the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, and 66 years after it ran aground on Gull Island, they finally hooked it up to a Polish boat, the Polish steamer, hauled it to Turkey, of all places, and scrapped it on a beach in Turkey in 1972. So I think they got their money. Gull Island is what we get to. Gull Island, the ship-eating monster. Okay, this happened, they say this was 1906. There have been several shipwrecks more. It took Congress another 23 years to get around to appropriating the money to put up this little lighthouse on Gull Island in 1929. There were 3 more shipwrecks in the interim. No one killed in any of them. 2 of them fairly minor. 1 of them a great big, another major shipwreck type thing. But finally, in 1929, they put up a stop sign at the corner, right? Basically, yeah. Just some examples. And I hope I kind of give it a flavor of some of the different ways that the lake can mess with human plans, no matter, even if you're an experienced fisherman like the Bataan brothers who knew what they were doing, and you can't fault them for making any mistakes. Or an overconfident, outsider like Mr. Shearis, or you know, a hot shot, best captain on the lake, like Captain Reed. Again, the lake is the one that calls the shots. And we still have one more little problem to resolve. And that's back out on Stockton Island. And let's ask Julian, what exactly did happen after that? Julian? What happened? Well, so anyway, Halvor got the pond boat fixed up and back we went to Stockton. And then we loaded it up and started out again, and it was dead calm. And we got to Rocky, and it was just getting dark, and everything was fine. And we went to bed in the cabin right there on the boat. Oh yeah, we didn't take anything out of the cabin. We cooked and we slept and everything in the cabin while this was going on. And the next morning we unloaded it in fairly good time on Rocky because we'd learned a few things and had good practice by that point. Then we got it up there in very short order, and that was that. Well, actually no. Because the cabin was moved one more time, another 60 years later, or 53 years later, I guess, 2001. That cabin actually started at a different place on Stockton, and then was moved to the site of the Nelson Fish Camp, and then it was moved to Rocky, and then in 2001, a rather complicated arrangement having to do with the life leases of the properties on Rocky Island. It was moved from Julian Nelson's property to his son Bobby's property out there on Rocky Island, and I happened to actually be out there for that day. That's my picture. So that little cabin has had 4 different locations in its lifetime. And it's there now. The whole little Rocky Island settlement has been designated as a historic district, so it's going to be left there, and the Park Service has a responsibility now to look after it. The Nelson family still has a life lease there in the names of my friend Bobby Nelson and his sister Heidi Nelson. Bobby is exactly my age, so hopefully he's got a little more time left out there on the island, but eventually it will come into the full control of the National Park and the people of the United States, and they're taking really good care of it. My hat is definitely off. My hat's off to Julian Nelson for many ways. Julian continued fishing up until about 1960. Talking to him, he said, well, I probably fished about 5 years too long. I hated to give it up, but by that time there was nothing left to fishing. So after he finally sold his boat, he became a ferry captain on the Madeline Island Ferry Line and spent the next couple of decades driving a boat back and forth between Bayfield and Madeline Island. So his entire career, his entire working life was spent on Lake Superior in one way or the other. And the one thing that in particular I admire about Julian Nelson, during the 1960s, he was the mayor of Bayfield. And it was during the period when there was talk of an Apostle Islands National Lake Shore. And needless to say, the prospect of a federal park in the area was very appealing to some people and very intimidating to other people. A lot of families lost their properties or lost the ability to use places they'd been going for a long time. And Julian Nelson was one of them. Julian Nelson, as mayor of Bayfield, took a strong stand in favor of the establishment of the National Lake Shore. He said, I'm going to lose my place because of this. He says, but it's the right thing to do. He also said, and he knew at the time that taking that stand in Bayfield would be very unpopular and it would lose him the next election, and it did. But, 30 years later, when I talked to him, he said, no, that was the right thing. And if the book that Kennedy wrote 50 years ago, Profiles in Courage, if they ever put another chapter, I would nominate Julian Nelson to be one of them. He is now 100 years old. He turns 101 in a few weeks. He's living here in Washburn at the Oaks. I was hoping maybe to get him here, but Bobby said he didn't think he'd be up to it today. But of the people I've met in my time at the Apostle Islands, Julian Nelson is very high in the list of those I admire. And yeah, let's take a look. What's he looking like these days? It was 2 years ago at Little Sand Bay, when they brought back Merle Allen's remains. Yeah, 3 years ago at Little Sand Bay. He was still up and around pretty well out there. He doesn't see too well anymore, but his mind is still very sharp. And as I say, I've been hoping to get him here, but he just wasn't up to it. But yeah, Julian, thanks for so many things, that praise among them. So, ladies and gentlemen, with my great thanks to you coming out on this crummy night, I hope it was worth your time and you enjoyed it. And remember, the lake is the boss. And if you want any other, here my some of my stories and articles online at my webpage, and it's free. Thanks again.